Welcome
Right.
to Blue Retro, Nick Purewal. How's it going?
Very well, thank you, Chris. How are you?
Yeah, very good. So, what can you tell us about the new book then, Sanctioned?
Yeah, well, out now, published by Bite Back Publishing, and yeah, it's a project I've been working on for the best part of 2 years, really. And one of the standout features of the book, obviously, is the fact that I am probably definitely the first person to sit down at length for an interview with Roman Abramovich, and did that twice. First time in Istanbul in January 2024, and then again in Abu Dhabi in January this year. So a remarkable experience, really, and a real coup, and something that I hope comes across really well in the book. I think it was obviously across his time as a tenure as Chelsea owner. I think his attitude was always to let his actions and instructions do the talking. But he felt that I think he'd always wanted to kind of give his side of the story at some point, and to him this felt like the right time. So I've been extremely lucky that it was me who got the opportunity to do that.
Yeah, it was definitely a coup because, as you mentioned, Roman was a very private person, wasn't he?
Yeah,
Still
and I
is,
think,
I imagine.
yeah, no, absolutely, and look, the way I would read that as is something that was always, I think, carried out in Chelsea's best interests. And speaking to a couple of people who are close friends of his, in the course of the research for the book, and people who work with him, and other things, everyone said the same thing, which was that one of the reasons he took that approach was so that he could make a clear boundary between being the owner, but making sure that he didn't tread on people's toes in terms of decision making. So he completely respected the chain of command, and one thing he really wanted to do was put people in positions of authority and give them that authority and respect that. So one of the things a friend of his was telling me was that over the years, obviously people around Roman Abramovich would say, oh, we've heard about this amazing player who's coming through an academy somewhere else in the world, and he's going to be the next big thing. You should go out and get him. And he would always say, stop, don't tell me. And he would kind of stop the conversation. And one of the reasons was because he would say, even if you're saying that it's the next Lionel Messi or whatever, he would say, it's that's not my job. My job is to put everything in place, and it's other people's job to make those decisions. So I think that was a big part of Chelsea's success under Abramovich, really. And in some ways, obviously, it's vastly more complicated than this, but in some ways, it's square pegs for square holes, and similar. And I think that that's where it starts, isn't it? But obviously, it ends with a glittering trophy laden 19 years.
Yeah, and of course, as you mentioned, you'd like to leave it in place for the people to run the football club. To begin with, there was Peter Kenyon at Chelsea, and then, of course, there was Mourinho as manager. I think he did everything perfect as far as the Chelsea support goes, really, in that period. He was fantastic, Roman.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly. I think he's extremely proud of the legacy, really, and obviously what's happened since is very difficult. But I think he's also completely come to terms with all of that, and is generally at peace with everything that's happening. He's quite a phlegmatic man anyway, so he's very able to be a realist, and react to what happens in front of him. And he's certainly somebody who only tends to look forward. So I think it was rare for him to be reflective, as he had to be in the interview, really. So that's another thing that's obviously really really important that comes across in the book.
And how long did you get to speak with Roman? You mentioned that you spoke to him twice.
Yeah. So yeah, it was probably about both interviews were probably about 4 or 5 hours in total. So a good length of time. And he was obviously very generous with his time, and with his cooperation. And it's brilliant because obviously so many things that have happened to him since Russia invaded Ukraine. Part of what's happened is obviously very, very dangerous and very serious, and quite scary. But I think he's managed to negotiate all of that very very carefully, and yeah, I think in the way that he's spoken, obviously, nothing was off limits, but obviously he's had to be fairly measured about what he said. But I think it's great, really, that after all this time, he was able to, I suppose, square the circle with being able to give his side of things. Because certainly across the course of the sale process, everyone else was able to talk, weren't they? And obviously it was extremely public. It played out in public,
Yeah.
much more than any other sale of a football club ever would, and probably ever will again, potentially. But obviously he wasn't able to speak at all in that period of time. So yeah, I think it's certainly what I'd hope about the book, and I think I'm really pleased that it's been received in this way. Is that hopefully it's the definitive account of that period of time, and from the start, from the outset of the project, I always had Chelsea supporters in mind, because I covered the sale process in my previous role as Chelsea correspondent for the Press Association, and as that was unfolding, yes, there was an awful amount of information that was public, but also there was probably just as much that couldn't be reported or wasn't able to be reported at the time, just because of the volume of information, and obviously some of it was sensitive at the time as well. So it did feel like it would bear revisiting and retelling in detail.
I mean, it's terrible the way it ended, obviously, but it doesn't feel right. But what I mean is, it was kind of a big soap opera when he was our owner, in the best possible way, because obviously we signed the best players, we sacked lots of managers. I loved all that, if I'm honest. I thought the
Yeah,
unstable, the unpredictability of it was actually something that was a lot of fun as a supporter.
yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting. I was speaking to somebody who had worked for him, worked for him and for Chelsea across probably the majority of his tenure. And I think what this person was saying that actually in a lot of cases, obviously results and performances and styles of performances will clearly have a massive contribution to a situation where a manager is sacked. But actually, in the end, invariably it's a breakdown of the relationship between the decision maker at any one club and the manager. And so, I think that's kind of what happened, what would happen, and that's natural, really. And I think also that one of the things that Roman Abramovich and his people quickly realised is that the cycle of football is so quick, isn't it? That obviously, okay, of course, you'll have the odd manager, a few generational managers, people like Pep Guardiola, Sir Alex Ferguson, who can define an era, who could take one club across multiple decades and sort of keep reinventing themselves and their squad and keep winning. But actually, for a lot of managers and for a lot of tenures, it just doesn't work like that, does it? And sometimes 2.5, 3 years is actually about as much as you might sort of expect to get out of even a top manager in terms of a winning sort of cycle. So I think that was kind of how things shook out. I mean, obviously it didn't always work like that, did it? Some of the tenures were much shorter, but I think what they were able to do because of the structure that was so agile, they were able to pivot really quickly. If they decided they needed to make a change, it's something that could happen very, very quickly. And in the end, that was to Chelsea's benefit.
Yeah, and I don't think Chelsea necessarily needed that at the time. The managers you speak of, ideally, yes, but because they had such a great dressing room there, the likes of John Terry, Lampard, Drogba, as you say, they were able to have managers for a few seasons and then move on to the next one.
Yeah, I think so, and that's right. And I think a lot of that, obviously comes from culture, and culture is a real buzzword, isn't it? But really, in many ways, if you break culture down to its smallest component part, ultimately it's only behaving well, isn't it? That's where it starts. And treat other people the way you want to be treated, and respect yourself, hold high personal standards, for work and time off. And I think that's what you've seen with those players that you talk about. And certainly that's always been the ethos at Cobham, which is obviously the training centre in the academy, and and that's obviously something else that Roman Abramovich transformed in his time. And I think that, one of the things that continues to be a strength of Cobham and Chelsea's, academy setup is the aim is to treat each player individually and do everything in their powers to drive that player to the highest possible level that player can reach. Not every player who's in the Chelsea academy will play for the Chelsea first team, but I know that all the staff there feel a real personal pride and responsibility to make sure that that player gets the absolute maximum out of their football career. And I think that's a really great ethos, because actually what that does do is it generates an awful lot of very adept, high quality football players and individuals for the whole football pyramid. So it's a bit like trickle down economics, isn't it? And obviously, okay, perhaps people would argue that trickle down economics doesn't necessarily work, but I think in terms of player development in football, I think it actually does.
And I think one of the most interesting things you spoke about when I saw your other interview on TalkSport was that Abramovich was poisoned. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So he, and this is one of the key things that was fascinating about this project from the start, and really what allows the narrative to be built of the book, which is that the two things were happening at the same time, in that on the one hand, Chelsea had to be sold, but on the other hand, Roman Abramovich was the only person who agreed to try to broker peace talks, or try to set up peace talks, facilitate peace talks between Russia and Ukraine. The Ukrainian government reached out, contacted more than 40 people of high profile, high net worth, famous people, and asked them to help. And Roman Abramovich was the only person who said yes. And speaking to people from all sides of the equation, and that's effectively because he was the only person brave enough to do it. And so on the day that he put Chelsea up for sale, the 2nd of March, that was obviously the day that Chelsea played Luton in the FA Cup at Kenilworth Road. And so from a standpoint of the fans who were there, I was at the ground covering the match, and the news came out as we were. The statement was released as we were sat in the press box waiting for the in the build up to the game, and obviously that completely changed the complexion of the match itself, how we covered it, how the fans were reacting. Obviously fans in the Chelsea fans, the away fans, were chanting Roman Abramovich's name and things like that, and it was it was a really tense night, wasn't it, for a lot of reasons. And but at the same time, while no one knew this at the time, but actually that day, Roman Abramovich picked up the phone and spoke to a couple of his trusted advisors to tell them to draft the statement, and that it would be released and that Chelsea was for sale, in full. But he put the phone down from that call, and then he flew from Turkey to, to Poland, and then drove into Ukraine, because of the war zone. The only way to get in would be by car or train perhaps, but definitely by car. And he went and stayed in an apartment in Kyiv that night, and it was set up, and he had meetings the next day with the Ukrainian delegation. And he and two others had some food that had been prepared, and the last thing he remembers of that evening is stepping into another room to take a phone call. So he stepped away for a bit of privacy to have this phone call. The next thing he remembers after that is waking up hours later, having passed out, and when he came to, he was blind. He couldn't see, and the skin was peeling off his hands and his face, and some of his hair was falling out. So, and the others who'd eaten the food had the same symptoms, so they were rushed to hospital and had emergency treatment. And then from there, they actually went. He was determined that he would go to the meetings that were arranged with the Ukrainian delegation on the next morning. So, against the better judgment and advice of the medics, who were saying, look, you need more treatment, he went anyway. And his sight was starting to return by this point, but he was sort of sat in this meeting with, his eyes watering constantly. So he couldn't really see, even though his sight wasn't restored at this point. His sort of face was wet with tears, and so he was, obviously his eyes were full of the watering as well. But while they were in that meeting, they discovered that one of the Ukrainian delegation, the person who was tasked with with meeting directly with the Russians, Russian counterparts, he'd actually been shot dead, a couple of days previously. So I think that was the point at which they really believed that what happened wasn't coincidental or some kind of piece of bad luck, in that it was a deliberate attack. And later, after more tests, independent experts confirmed that they had been poisoned. So he obviously, thankfully, made a full recovery. His sight is markedly worse, though. I mean, he obviously can see fine. He just needed stronger prescription in his glasses. So yeah, you're saying not quite 100% recovery actually, but largely fine. And yeah, so clearly a very unnerving set of circumstances and the situation to happen. But interestingly, speaking to lots of people around him, they said that he just wasn't. He just didn't sort of show any fear or didn't seem to be scared by anything that happened. Was just very calm and quite matter of fact about everything. And that's certainly how he was when we talked it through. Which is remarkable, isn't it? Because I suppose lots of people would hope that I'm sure we all like to think we'd be good in a crisis, don't we?
You don't know until it happens.
But exactly, and I think he's somebody who has very probably clearly unwanted, but some very good evidence to back up the fact that he is good in a crisis.
And how comes we didn't hear about it until now? Really, what was the reason for that?
It was reported, to a certain extent at the time, but I think even in terms of his role in back channeling to try to facilitate peace talks, that was a role that began and ended with passing messages. He wasn't involved in any of the negotiations or anything like that. He was really just trying to set up a platform for people to meet and talk and to have dialogue. Even in that role, it wasn't something that he and his people would have sought to publicize, but it was something that the Ukrainians were keen to get out there. And it did come out, and I broke the world exclusive about that and sort of corroborated it through lots of different sources and things, and that was at the point where they did confirm that was what was happening. But I think they would have far rather preferred that was private, because the more private that was, the easier it was for him to fulfill that role to the best of his ability. And in terms of the poisoning, a similar kind of thing. I think partly because they didn't try to find out exactly the source of the poison, so they didn't get as far as thinking about who might have carried it out. And I think that was extremely prudent not to sort of press any of that. But again, another thing, I think they probably felt like publicity on that would have again acted as a blocker to him for carrying out the role, and he was entirely concerned with carrying out the role and trying to help where he could in terms of facilitating those processes. And I think that's greatly to his credit, really.
And I suppose since talking to Roman, obviously that's why the story's even bigger now.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this wasn't by design. It's just takes a long time to to write a book and get a book deal and all those sorts of things. But I think 3 years after the sale, I think actually the whole book probably benefits from that, from a bit of distance and a bit of perspective. We can start to see all of those events in a bit of context. And especially with regards to the new ownership and what's coming now for Chelsea, and just kind of being able to analyse such a fraught period of time, but also the the repercussions of that, which are still being felt, aren't they?
And of course, Roman wrote off our debt as well, which he didn't have to do. I mean, he could have taken it the wrong way, couldn't he? He could have said, well, but he didn't have to do that, did he?
No, no, and I think that a key thing of what he wanted to do was pass Chelsea safely and securely onto a new set of custodians who would be able to take the club forward in the manner to which it had become accustomed. To be quite honest, and I think he felt that was a great responsibility of his, and I think he definitely saw being owner of Chelsea in that custodian mould. And I think that that's something that sometimes is bandied about, isn't it, by owners, or something that maybe looks nice in a statement. But I think he proved over, a very extended period of time that his actions backed up that, backed up that would support that idea. And yeah, absolutely, because he would always fund everything that needed funding. He would always do so out of his own personal money.
Yeah, and of course it was the record, wasn't it? Chelsea being bought.
Yeah, exactly. And interestingly, that was, it was for, a global sports franchise, and that's been, eclipsed a few times since now, which just shows you where global sport and investment in global sport is headed. But yeah, exactly. And I think if Chelsea had been able to have been sold under, well, I think, look, without the circumstances, I don't think Abramovich would have sold the club then. But also, had the club been sold without, without it being a distressed asset, i.e., as a result of sanctions and as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, then I think that the asking price, could have been comfortably £1 billion higher. And I think that's something that, I did interview Todd Bowley as well, and this isn't something that we talked about or he sort of discussed, but I think that I would draw the conclusion that it isn't the biggest coincidence that when people talk about that number of £1 billion of early investment from the new owners into the playing squad and everything else, I think that correlates with the idea of Chelsea being valued at £1 billion more under different circumstances, and I think that I think their determination to invest heavily from the off, I think, is really encouraging, and I think it showed that they weren't just grabbing the opportunism of effectively what might be considered a bargain purchase, because obviously they had the financial clout and the wherewithal to invest on top of that and keep that going forward.
Yeah, even this transfer window, I think Chelsea have spent more than Liverpool now, or they will be.
Well, I think it's I think it is to their credit, and speaking with Todd, meeting with him, and sitting down with him in his office in London, that was extremely fascinating and revealing as well. And it's I've been a journalist for 20 years, and I've interviewed all sorts of different people from all sorts of different walks of life. I've done lots of news journalism, lots of sports journalism, and after a while, it's easy to tell who is being who's on the level, and perhaps if someone may not be. And I think the one thing, there are lots of sort of correlations between Roman Abramovich and Todd Bowley, and I think one of them is that they are both very direct, very straightforward, and I think in their own very different ways, they both care deeply about Chelsea. I think one thing also that's to Todd Bowley's credit is that he absolutely wouldn't want to be trying to sort of draw any parallels between himself and the Abramovich era, and I think that's very respectful to the former ownership, but also to the Chelsea supporters, really, because he probably could try to draw some through lines of a legacy, but he hasn't done that, and I think that's because the previous ownership, the previous leadership selected the Bowley Clearlake consortium as the most fitting owners for Chelsea moving forward. And within that, one of the reasons was because they identified Todd Bowley and Badad Eghbali as having the most similar kind of mindset, approach, and attitude to the club as Roman Abramovich had. And that was those decisions from people like Marina Granovskaya and Bruce Buck. Now, that's something that Todd and Badad have never trumpeted. But they really could have. It'd be completely legitimate if they were sort of shouting that from the rooftops. But I think it's to their credit that they haven't. And obviously, it was a very difficult start, wasn't it? But I think obviously, it probably comes across, I'm a bit of an optimist anyway. But I would like to think and hope that for Chelsea and the supporters that things are on a bit more of a solid footing now, and hopefully they can push back towards, the heights that they had achieved before.
Yeah, last season in the end was pretty good, to be honest. I mean, we finished in the top four and we won a trophy. So I think if you said to most supporters at the start of the season, would you take that? You'd snatch that person's hand off, definitely. That was good. It was good in the end. I mean, it was sort of like it all came together at the end. It could have gone a different way, it could have, but it didn't. So but you can't really argue with that. I do think they show a longer vision, though, a longer approach than new owners, I would say. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Not necessarily with managers, although Maresca obviously kept his job, but in terms of the recruitment of players, it's looking to the future, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's that's something that they that Todd Bowley and his partners certainly the model they look to employ at the Dodgers, and that's really come to fruition in the last few years now, and now they're a real powerhouse in MLB, aren't they? And I think that's something they're very much keen to emulate with Chelsea. And I think that certainly some of those players that they've signed who are coming up on the rails in the next few years have very, very excellent pedigrees, and you never know, do you, whether players will fulfill their potential. And obviously it's really difficult in football, but I think if two or three of those guys hit their potential, then Chelsea will be in an extremely strong position. And I do think that some of the business they've done in the window so far looks pretty astute, really. I think Delap is a good signing in that respect, because I think he's got a lot of growth in him, and there aren't many actual nines around, are there? So but he's one who can actually play as well, and he plays heads up football, and he's a focal point, and obviously then João Pedro as well. Obviously it's easy to look at that and think, yes, it's another player from Brighton, but I also think he's somebody who's developed an awful lot in his time in England, and so what he has there is he doesn't need any time to adapt to the Premier League, which is always potentially difficult for new players coming from overseas. And he's got quite a different profile from lots of players. So I think those two complement each other. It feels like the biggest challenge with with whoever's the manager of Chelsea, and obviously for Maresca at this time, is you have an awful lot of resources now, and that's a good squad, and so it's capable of a lot. But it's the biggest challenge for him is maximising the output of those players, and really specifically, it's what's the blend of your 11, because you have a squad, you'll need the squad. Really, you probably want two interchangeable 11s, don't you? Really. And I think they probably will have that, but then it's just about sort of maximising the potential of whichever 11 takes the field, and then within that, individual players, guys like, I know Reece James has had awful lots of wretched luck with injuries, but before all of those injuries started, and at the time building up to the sale, he was somebody who was very much on Real Madrid's radar, and hit list for a potential transfer. If things had gone differently, I don't see any reason. Well, I mean, I don't see any reason why they wouldn't have been pursuing him rather than Trent Alexander-Arnold, for example. You don't know whether Reece would want to leave Chelsea, but but I think that that was the level he was at then. Real Madrid were considering him as a potential future Galactico. So he is somebody who can be. He could be Chelsea's best player bar none, can't he? And he can be one of the standout players in the world. And so then it's just about seeing how they balance all that out. Because in my personal opinion, is that he's probably, he might be hard pressed to do that inverting. So then if that's the case, then how do you do you invert from the left, from left fullback, or do you not invert, basically? And is it more important to get the best out of Reece James, or more important to to maximise the overall output of an 11 a different way? And what does that mean for Enzo and Lavia and Caicedo. So yeah, it's fascinating. But I
And
think
as you
these,
mentioned, he's had so many injuries. I mean, that's the biggest thing with him, really. I mean, he's been
yeah,
fantastic for Chelsea, but it's not his fault at all. Um, but I'd say this season, I think we should be a bit realistic as Chelsea supporters. I would say. I mean, yeah, I want us to do better than last season, but I think considering we're in the Champions League, I would take top four again. That sounds a bit. I want to be more ambitious than that, but I do think it's going to be a lot harder this season. We won't be
yeah,
able to play such a weak team in the Champions League as we did in the Conference
yeah.
League.
Mm.
So from that respect, it will be a tougher season, I think.
Yeah, and I think that in many ways, it's easier to win the Champions League than it is to win the Premier League. And I think that the standard of the Premier League and the teams within it is such that um, even just to win one at nowadays is absolutely a remarkable achievement. So and there are so many high quality clubs who can, if someone has an off season like a City, for example, there's nothing to say that one of the other clubs can't step into their shoes. Really, if you think, look at the quality. I mean, no one would have said it was a classic Premier League sort of title race, perhaps, but Liverpool were still, excellent and overwhelmingly deserving of their title, and and what a remarkable passing of the baton from Klopp to to Arne Slot and everything that goes with that. It's almost unheard of, isn't it? That, but it even despite in a season where Manchester United and Tottenham grossly underperformed given their status and were perhaps lucky not to end up in relegation battles, two of the one of the traditional big four and two of the traditional big six were nowhere near the top six, but nobody would have said it was any easier to qualify, to finish in the top six or the top four of the Premier League. And I think, there isn't another league in the world like that, is there? So, for the neutral, for the for a supporter, that's phenomenal, phenomenally exciting. And,
I mean, I'm
yeah,
encouraged that we got three strikers this season
yeah,
because I do think we did well last season. Jackson did well. He got a good goal tally, but we do need more competition up front, and I think that's going to help him as well.
absolutely. And I think the thing is, if you have this model where you are going to have players who are developing on the job, then they need time out of the team because your growth comes as much from rest as effort. It's just like building muscle. It really is because a lot of it is building, your mental understanding and building your brain power for understanding the sort of automations and everything else and the patterns that are required, and even sometimes just the muscle memory for finishing. And so yeah, sometimes time out of the team will be just as important as time in it. And another element of that is it takes a little bit of pressure off in terms of goals. Maybe if there's a bit less pressure, maybe that translates to a much more relaxed, much more, upbeat player. And sometimes that can be the sort of thing that really is the making. Also, with the extra competition, comes a much bigger battle for places, and people have to raise their level, otherwise they could get left behind. So, it was required, wasn't it? Chelsea needed more quality and more numbers at the top end of the field, and I think that's I think they've gone a good way there because there's obviously not a glut of high quality sort of strikers around on the market, but even someone like Gyökeres and Gyökeres and Sesko are available, aren't they? But neither of them have Premier League experience, and that's always a slight unknown. I think certainly, to my mind, I think Gyökeres would be absolutely fine in the Premier League. I think he'll score a bag full of goals, wherever he ends up if he comes to England. But with Sesko, I think there would be a transition required, and so with the lap, it's a bonus that he already has that season under his belt, and he proved he proved he's a goal scorer, didn't he? And I think that's really really important. So yeah, it's exciting, really.
Yeah, and back to the book Sanctioned. Show us the copy. I think you got a copy there.
Yeah. Here we go. So yeah, it is out now, and it's yeah, it's very available. So yeah, it's on Amazon, and yeah, so it's yeah, and things going really well, and I'm delighted that it's been received really well. To be honest, it's when you're putting something together and you believe in it, and you're confident that that it's it's strong. You always have that moment before anyone else has really seen it, where you start to think, well, is it really? Am I really right? Or you have that moment of self doubt. But no, it's been great. It's come together really well, and it was a very rewarding experience, and a great challenge putting it together. And yeah, I'm delighted it's out there. To be honest.
How long did it take you to put the book together?
Well, the first conversation about the book happened in November 2023. So I've been in one guise or another working on it since then. And then the first interview with Roman Abramovich was January 24. So, and yeah, then, yeah, so I mean, it kind of, in stages, I think. So it's hard to say, hard to gauge how long it took actually sitting down and writing. But I mean, there's so much research, and so many. I interviewed more than 50 people for the book, so there's so much of research, so many interviews, double figures in terms of different timelines for all the different events, sort of condensing it all together. So there was an awful lot that happened before I even sat down and put words on the page, really. So yeah, it was kind of a very staged process, one step at a time. But so yeah, in all that time, I was probably always doing something relevant to it. So sometimes the actual writing is it's kind of it's the tip of the spear. It's the culmination of a lot of hard work that's gone in. And I think if that hard work and that ordering is is as tight as you want it to be, then hopefully the process for the writing is feels fluid.
Yeah, and of course, at the time, Chelsea had a transfer embargo as well, which made it even more dramatic.
Yeah, well, I mean, as soon as so yeah, Roman Abramovich was sanctioned by the UK government on the 10th of March, and so Chelsea were Chelsea, an asset of Roman Abramovich's. The club was frozen, so unable to do anything at that point until the government issued a temporary operating license, and so within that they imposed a lot of very strict terms for that operating license. Yeah, so no transfers, very tight spending limits, and so yeah, that caused chaos. To be honest, some of those limits had to be relaxed as things went on, just simply in order that Chelsea could actually complete the season, because some of the limits were so tight that Chelsea would have run out of money, within the time frame. So things had to be eased up from the government side of things, and they were. But at every stage, everything was a real battle, and everything was very down to the wire and last minute. And because of the 31st of May deadline for the expiration of that temporary operating license that the government wouldn't renew, they made it clear they wouldn't renew it or extend it. It wouldn't renew the license or extend that deadline. If the sale hadn't been completed by the 31st of May, then Chelsea would have folded. The club would have gone into administration, and that would have been catastrophic. There's something like 500 businesses in the borough, aside from anyone employed directly by Chelsea, but there's something like 500 businesses in the borough that wouldn't exist if Chelsea didn't exist. So, I mean, I'm not sure what the numbers are, but you can reason. I think it's more than reasonable to think if there's 500 businesses, there's at least, and probably a lot more, at least 1,000, but probably a lot more than that in terms of jobs, and and so that would be obviously catastrophic for a local economy. Even before you start to think about any kind of emotional tie or community tie or any of these sorts of things, every football club is an institution, isn't it, in England, whatever the level. Do you know what I mean? And I think it's I think obviously you know, a Premier League club that, you know, two-time Champions League winners and those sorts of things, the most decorated clubs, it's easy to see that, or to consider their importance as greater than other clubs further down the pyramid. But try telling that to any fan of any club. So, you
Yeah,
know, we both know that, don't we? And it's and if it's your team, it's you know, it's everything. And so, you know, there are, you know, thousands of people, you know, who go, you know, who at the bridge, you know, only place to be every other Saturday, right? You know,
yeah,
like the banner says, right? And this, you know, so you know, there are thousands of people who fall into that category, but millions more all around the world you know, millions of people who may never, you know, get to go to the bridge, but you know, Chelsea's a massive part of their life, and so yeah, I think when the deal was able to be completed, you know, at the very much at the 11th hour, right at the last. I think everyone involved in it was number one, ready for, you know, a good long sleep, but also two, very very relieved that they got everything over the line.
big sigh of relief. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
but yeah, as you mentioned, going to the bridge now. I mean, I've had my season ticket since Ranieri was the manager, so that's 2000 and early 2000s, wasn't it? So
Hmm.
that was when Abramovich came in. Really,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
go in the 90s as well, but I didn't have a season ticket then. But apart from, I mean, obviously he's got to be one of the best owners ever, Abramovich. All the trophies we won, and his attitude was always second best wasn't good enough. And as a supporter, that's what you love to hear, it really, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
trying to think of occasions he got it wrong. There wasn't many. Perhaps when Ancelotti got the sack when we were second, so that's maybe one of them. But overall, I haven't got any complaints, you know, because he was an amazing owner. And something else that people might not know who aren't Chelsea supporters who go is that the season ticket prices hardly ever went up in all that time period. A little bit, but
Mm.
not a lot, you know. So I don't think he was really ever. I don't think he was in it for the money. I think it was
No,
the game.
no, absolutely not. I mean, and that's, you know, and actually, I mean, you know, there's a chapter in the book about, you know, when he took over and his take on taking over Chelsea really for the first, and he's got, so it's him, you know, explaining that you know, or his side of things, for, you know, again for the first time ever as well, and that was fascinating, and that's exactly what he said. You know, he was kind of, you know, he effectively wanted to retire or semi-retire, you know, and he was ready to, you know, yeah, I think he was 41, you know, and he was ready to, you know,
Nice.
take a step back and you know, from frontline business, and you know, friends of his said, you know, that he had always sort of said to him, you should buy a football club, and he, before this point, he'd kind of not really listened to it, but he was interested in football, but he wasn't a fanatic by any stretch. But he was, you know, a couple of his friends convinced him at the last minute to go to the Man United Real Madrid Champions League second leg of the course final in that's in March 2003 or April 2003, I think, and at Old Trafford, and he went, and he was, you know, as he was talking about that experience, he was describing walking with the other fans to the ground. You know, they parked the car, and then he was walking, you know, with the throng, basically, you know, to the ground. And it was the first time he'd sort of done that, I think. And he could sort of, he said he could really feel the energy and the excitement and the anticipation. And that, you know, as he was talking about it, and you know, you could see his body language and his eyes were lighting up, and you could really see what I felt he was doing was describing every football supporter's experience, right? Whatever your team is, whatever your club is, whether you get the bus, the train, you drive, you know, you know, when you shut the door, shut your front door, and you walk around the corner, the part of that journey that's a walk. Everyone always takes the same route, don't they? I mean, you know, we're creatures of habit, but there's something really sort of special about that. And so, you know, you bump into the same people, you walk the same way, and there's that sort of power in routine and familiarity. And I think he was experiencing this for the first time, and it kind of, he was captivated by it, and you could see he kind of fell in love really that night. It was a, you know, a very, you know, amazing game. And he said that you know, they went afterwards, they left and he flew back to Moscow overnight, and he said it was the first time ever he didn't sleep all the way. Normally he would just sleep and and then be able to sleep all the way and then be able to work the next day, get up as normal. But he just basically couldn't sleep because he was so wired, and he was so and so basically he organised a meeting first thing the next morning, and the operation with very much priority number one by a football club. And so that was only so it was only uh, 3 months later, maybe 3-4 months later, that he bought Chelsea. So it was a remarkably quick process, and yeah, I think obviously everyone knows what happened next, because he put the foot down, didn't he? And Chelsea started winning pretty quickly and transformed the club, the Premier League, and world football. And I think it's certainly clear that he absolutely loved that, and in that process became and always will be a massive Chelsea supporter. And I think that's I think that's something that Chelsea supporters can rightly be proud of and believe in.
Yeah. Now, I saw him once, actually. It was after we won the league title for the first time in 50 years. He was walking down the street, down Fulham.
Mm.
Me and my dad, we were sitting in the beer garden, and we saw him. All of the other Chelsea fans did as well, and we saw his bodyguards in the background. There was quite a few of them undercover, as you would imagine. And we were singing his name, and every pub, obviously, that he walked past, they were all singing his name, and he gave us a nice round of applause. And that's great, because you always remember that. It's a small moment that you always remember when you saw Abramovich.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think he uh, was probably, I think, just guessing, I think he was probably quite surprised at the level of sort of focus that there would be on him. But yeah, I think he sort of managed to navigate that quite well, really. There's a really difficult balance, isn't there? I think for any owner of or any figurehead of a club, in terms of how much should you talk. And I think the balance is different now. I think one thing that one advantage in pretty much in every facet that he always had was his ability to, because he had obviously total ownership of the club, and it was all through private money. There wasn't any kind of investment element. He didn't have any other concerns to think about. He didn't have sort of investors to or shareholders and anything like that to sort of satisfy. And I think that the way the sport has gone now, it would be extremely difficult for an individual to to have or to choose, really. It'd be unlikely for an individual to choose to take sole control of a club in that fashion. And so I think it is really to Chelsea's benefit now that that Todd Boehly's shareholding is from his private money. And I think it's I would think it's important for any club to have at least one of the main investors for their money to come from their own wealth, because I think that means, I think that focuses the mind for the individual to take a much more personal approach to the concern. And but then really most of these clubs now need investment from sources like Clear Lake, for example, like a fund like that, and obviously that brings with it other kind of demands, really. So I think sometimes when you see some of the owners speaking, it's because to a certain extent they kind of have to sometimes, and it's not a bad thing, but yeah, it's just about, I think, balance.
Yeah. And apart from Abramovich, who do you think was the most interesting interview you did for the book?
Well, um, hmm.
Put you on the spot now. There was probably quite a few.
Well, no, I mean, look, Abramovich was that was fascinating. Todd Boehly, it was absolutely brilliant that he gave his time, and I think that was really very, very important, really, for the book that he did. But it was really kind of him to do that, because he certainly didn't have to. He wasn't he didn't seek it out, and I think he really, I think if I hadn't, I think the fact I had spoken to Roman Abramovich is the reason he spoke, because it's kind of rounding out the whole thing, isn't it? and just to make sure that once he knew that a book was coming, that really he could have his own input to make sure that because what I wanted this to be was the definitive story and an accurate account of what happened. And so I think he was obviously motivated to help with that and make sure it was accurate, really. But no, I mean, fascinating. I think there's speaking to people who were there are lots of people that I couldn't name, but they were fascinating, all of them. And I think I've spoken to a fair few people who were involved, or who are involved in sort of peacekeeping efforts in the war, in the war in Ukraine, and who absolutely spoke on condition of anonymity, and that they'll always have that. But some of these conversations were things that they couldn't find a place for them in the book, but just the sorts of things they've been they've experienced, or they've been they were talking about, and the things that they've done or in working towards either peace or to help help sort of people evacuate civilians and things like that, humanitarian corridors and those sorts of things. It's a real eye-opener when you get a window into actually what's required to put something like a humanitarian corridor together, logistically and on the ground. And I think that you would know anyway that a job like that is very difficult, right? But I think that the people who are on the ground in war zones to do things like that, they deserve our ultimate respect and thanks, because they put their own lives in jeopardy for to try to save thousands of innocent lives, basically. And I think that that's something that it's really easy for all of us, and even in the if you think about the context of the book, right, it's really easy to take a lot of these things for granted, but actually I think there's lots of people who have been displaced but have been able to get out of Ukraine, but who are safe, and obviously they hope they could be able to go home, but they're safe by the grace of the absolute bravery of some very, very talented but selfless people.
And Abramovich spoke recently, or it might have even been from your book, and it touched a lot of people, what he said. Do you remember?
What's this?
There was recently Abramovich said how he'd love to return to Chelsea.
Yes, that is from the book. Yeah,
that's from the book.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yes, that's right. Well, yeah, yeah, no, I think, well, that's the thing. I think yes, there's a quote in there. He hopes that he could, just return once more to Chelsea to say a proper goodbye, really. But within that, he also said, that for him, football is, he's done with football ownership in this lifetime. It's, and I think that, that's something that Chelsea fans, another way in which Chelsea fans can be really proud, I think, of the Abramovich era, because I think that, he doesn't have any intention to buy another football club or be involved with another football club in a professional way. And I think that's just another way that underlines how much he cared about Chelsea and continues to care about Chelsea, and also I think probably does want that legacy to remain intact, because what they achieved in that era is remarkable.
That's true. Yeah. Well, thanks a lot for joining us, Nick. And Abramovich will always live on in the hearts of Chelsea supporters everywhere.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, thank you very much. Thanks for your time.